Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 10-minute Bible lesson. We appreciate you joining us today. Our lessons are still about the life of Joseph, and we're going to pick up from last time. And if you remember, Joseph's in prison. And what was he doing in prison? He was in prison for doing something that was right. In other words, he rejected the advances of his master's wife. And she told on him and told a lie on him and had him thrown in prison. But when he was in prison, God was with him. And it just so happened to be that he prospered when he was in prison because the guy running the prison saw that the Lord was blessing Joseph, and he kind of put him in charge of the prisoners. Now, two of the prisoners that he was overseeing and watching were servants of Pharaoh. Pharaoh had put his butler and his baker in prison. Now think about this. All of these things has to do with the plan of God coming together. So these two guys had dreams, each one of them. And it really got them, and they just so upset that nobody could interpret it. And Joseph saw that they looked terrible, and he said, "What's wrong?" And they told him. And you know what? Joseph was able to interpret those dreams, and by God's help he was. Now, he told them that be sure that when you see Pharaoh and you go back to see him, talk to him and ask him if he could get me out of this place. So I think this is really important. Now something else happened after that. Now, 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream. Imagine that. He has two dreams. And these dreams really upset him. He called all of his wise men and all of his magicians. He called all of them. And he asked them to come and to help and interpret that dream. And they could not. I want you to look at this verse. This is in Genesis chapter 41, verse 8. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. That's talking about Pharaoh. And he sent and called for all of the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. So here's the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful man in the world, and yet there was no one that could tell Pharaoh what his dreams meant. And so he was really disturbed about it, and it really bothered him. Now, do you remember that when Joseph was interpreting the dreams of the butler and the baker, he told them that the interpretations of dreams came from God? So Joseph was acknowledging that in his own self and his own power he couldn't do that, but God could do that. And here's something that's really interesting. After a while, and I think it must have jogged the butler's memory when Pharaoh was troubled about his dreams and he couldn't interpret them, he said that he remembered the things that he did wrong. He remembered that he was supposed to tell Pharaoh about this young Hebrew man who interpreted his dream and the baker's dream. And in that dream, it happened just exactly the way Joseph interpreted. He rose, he called the butler back out and put him back in his position. And what did he do to the baker? He hung the baker. So let's look in Genesis 41, verses 12 and 13. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there. Now this is the butler speaking. He's talking to Pharaoh. A servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Now it's interesting how God works his plans out. It's never, I don't think it's hardly ever the way we're hoping and the way that we're picturing in our mind, that we're thinking maybe God will work all this out and it'll be all worked out kind of the way I'm thinking. Now, God will work things out, but almost always it's not how we imagined it. And not only that, it's almost never in our timing because we always want it to be done sooner. But in God's timing and in God's way, God did. He's working out. Now, how was it that Pharaoh responded? Let's take a look in verse 14. That is to say, Genesis 41, verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothes, and came to Pharaoh. Now, I'd love to know what Joseph was thinking. I'm thinking he's in prison, like one day was just like any other day, and that day happened to come. And lo and behold, he's get these officers that come directly from Pharaoh. And he's probably wondering what's going on. And they tell him, you need to shave and you need to clean up and you need to change your clothes because Pharaoh wants to see you. I'm wondering, what was he thinking? Was he praying during all this time? I'm thinking he must have been. Did he think possibly this was an answer? Did he think he was in trouble? I'm just not sure. But did he think that the butler finally remembered him and told him? So let's go ahead and see what Pharaoh says to Joseph, and then how Joseph responds back to him. Now this is in verse 15 of Genesis 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. Now you got to think of it here. Is Joseph really on the spot now? Listen, he is on the spot because God has brought him to that spot, the very spot that he was supposed to be in, God working out his plan for him. So I want you to notice the wisdom that God has given Joseph, and he's gonna talk to Pharaoh. And here's what he's going to say in verse 16. Now, this is our last verse that we're going to be able to cover today, Genesis 41:16. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. I love that, don't you? I love the fact that Joseph not only was a guy who fled from Potiphar's wife and wouldn't do that sin, but he's a guy who gives God the glory and gives God the credit. He recognizes that he can't do it, but God can. And he tells the king of all of Egypt, I can't do this, but God will give you an answer of peace. Now we're going to have to wait until next time to see what happens between this interaction between Pharaoh and Joseph, and you don't want to miss it. Listen, we appreciate you joining us today, and we hope that you have a great week.